what has happened with Abraham Lincoln. It seems that it's going to get back, and they're going to replace the aircraft carrier with George Washington. And how do you see this? Is one part of the issue. The other point is Scott Bessent is talking about continuation of the war, putting pressure, economic pressure on Iran. It means that they're going to stay there. They're going to keep the blockade. And we don't know if they're going to attack, because the inner circle of Donald Trump believe that they can put pressure on Iran militarily with new attacks, with a new round of attack on Iran, which was mentioned by Channel 12 of Israel yesterday. The CENTCOM commander, Brad Cooper, said to Israelis that he's giving Donald Trump information, or he's providing them with, a new set of targets inside Iran that would force Iranians into negotiations. What is happening?
Of course, yeah, I'm sure it will. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, that's a plan that, yeah. I think this is plan C, right? Plan A was the regime change. Plan B was getting some type of civil war or unrest or instability, turning Iran into Syria. And plan C is this, somewhat akin to the 1991 to 2003 blockade and attacks on Iraq. If people recall, for those 12 years, you had that really stringent, harsh blockade and siege of Iraq. You had no-fly zones over both northern and southern Iraq. The United States was bombing Iraq every third or fourth day throughout the Clinton administration. And what did it achieve? Just absolute immiseration for the Iraqis, and Iraqi government that prospered through the black markets and the smuggling and everything else. So I think this idea that somehow it'll be different, or this time it'll work with Iran, when the conditions are entirely different than Iraq, not in the U.S. favor. Iran is a much larger nation, both geographically as well as population. It is much more diverse economically than Iraq. It also has been hardened for 47 years against basically war against the West, whether it be through siege and blockade or outright warfare. And as well, too, you have just a different leadership in Iran than you had in Iraq. You had this quasi royal family in Iraq with the Husseins, and in Iran, you do not have that. You had one Khatami replace the other Khatami, but in general sense, though, there is a governance in Iran that exists upon a foundation of theological and ideological belief, backed by a historic nationalism. That, again, you certainly can. I don't want to get too much into Iraq, but yeah, I think that's the plan and why they think it'll work. Oh, and I left out the big thing. I left out, of course, was the fact that Iran can fight back. Iran can fight back. Has fought back very well. Has defeated the Americans and the Israelis and the Arabs. So completely different circumstance than Iraq. But I think this is all they've got. This is the best they can do. And this is the issue with the U.S. empire, is it's been superficial. It's vapid. It's a paper tiger, however you want to describe it, because it can't even come up with ideas. So it's not just this idea that the American empire is superficial in the sense that its air forces and navies can't mount campaigns for more than a few months at a time without all the ships and planes breaking and them running out of munitions. But as well as the munitions not really having the effect that you say they're going to have, right? These weapons that were supposed to enable or establish air dominance over Iran, so that the United States Air Force and the Israeli Air Force could just freely fly over Iran and blow up whatever it wanted to. That never happened. So, you've got all these, again, superficialities, all the falsities of the promise of American military power exposed. But you also have, to a more important degree, this exposure of the really poor American leadership, right? The paucity in American leadership. This idea that they can't come up with anything else. This is the best they can do. The plan A failed, plan B, and oh, okay, well, let's try and do what we did with Iraq in the 90s. Maybe it'll work better this time. I mean, so this is essentially what we're looking at here.
Yeah. Do you feel that Donald Trump gonna stay there, and maybe the attack's gonna, the reports you mentioned, the first option was to topple the regime,
Right.
the government in Iran. So we are at the, I don't know what option we're right now facing. Is that going to be staying in the fight, continuing the blockade and economic pressure, or maybe together with some sort of attacks on Iranian soil? And what is your understanding of the situation right now we're in?
Well, one we can compare it to the Clinton administration, the Clinton regime. If we want to call the Iranians regime, we might as well call the Americans a regime as well. Particularly this one, Jesus. But like the rationality within the Clinton administration and the limited goals that they had. They were always trying to stir the pot in Iraq and try and get regime change, trying to get coups, and they had some that were attempted. They were all put down. But certainly the limitations and the expectations by the Clinton administration towards Iraq, I think, particularly in hindsight, were obvious, and they really were just trying to contain Saddam Hussein and hope for the best, hope for someone to overthrow his rule. Here, you can't say that because they've got this expectation that it's still all going to work. It's either that or they really just don't have any idea, which I guess equal parts here, right? Maybe they do really think it's going to work, but also too, maybe they just have no idea. We're dealing with such uncertainty here, with such an irrational, mad administration. And so I think what you're going to get then to your question of what option do they have, Nima, I think it's just going to be this continuance of what we've seen over the last several months, on again, off again war. Sometimes it's going to be military action for 2 weeks at a time. Other times it's going to be military action for a day or two. And then negotiations are going to be off and negotiations are going to be on. And I think this has the bulk of this has to do with Donald Trump wanting to be in control. Now, whether he's actively yielding that control, right, actively carrying out that control, he is setting the initiative or the tempo, the direction of this thing, or he's just reacting, again, is something we can debate. But I think in his mind, he's got his hand on the control, and he is turning the dial, war on, war off. Negotiations on, negotiations off. In his mind, he wants this thing to be fully something that he sets the standard for, the narrative for, the headlines for, et cetera. And so I think that's what you're dealing with. But I think, what does that mean in practice? I think it means that we're going to see what we've seen over the last several months repeated through his administration. And we just had the Iranians say the other day, maybe it was yesterday, that they're prepared to fight this into the next administration. So I don't think that's, I don't think that's a something that we can dismiss. I think it's likely, actually. I think that this goes on into the 2030s. Will have much to do with who takes over the White House in 2020, January 2029.
Matt, how you put the situation under Pete Hegseth and his administration, basically with the army, with the Navy, and we had Gerald Ford before.
Mm-hmm.
The forces on Gerald Ford, they were not happy with the situation, getting back, that sort of problem. You remember all those problems?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And then Abraham Lincoln, right now. And they're sending another aircraft carrier. It means that they're going to stay there almost for 5, 6, 8 months there. And how do you see the forces? Do you think it's getting to the point today? Ambassador Chas Freeman asked me to, to make it to question, to ask this question to our guests here who have the military background. What would be the situation? Are we going to see some sort of mutiny within the forces? They're going to go against these policies? What would be the reaction on their part? What would be the limitations on their part, to go against these policies?
You won't see a mutiny. I mean, and these stresses that you're seeing get exposed on the Lincoln, and if it's happening on the Lincoln, it's happening, excuse me, on every other ship out there. So if it's happening on a carrier, it's happening on the destroyers, it's happening on the frigates, it's happening on the assault vessels, on the logistics ships, etc. Um, being underway for that long is too long. That's the reason why the Navy doesn't do it. If being underway for 250 days without having a port call in 200 days or whatever it was something that was routine, something that wasn't going to exhaust your crew, something wasn't going to break their spirit, something that hasn't been understood throughout the life of the U.S. Navy, they would routinely do that. But you don't, because the stress is too much on the crew. The exhaustion is too much on the crew. People out there who are saying, "Oh, these are wusses," if anyone's saying that, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. Frankly, that's as simple as that. There's a reason why they pull into port every 30 to 45 days. Because crew exhaustion is a real thing. Being on a ship at sea is like being on a prison where you only have a view of the ocean. That's it, of the sea. And if anyone's been at sea, like I have, there is something about that that's very true. Most I was only underway was at one point was about 2 weeks. That's the longest I spent underway without having a port call. And that was a long, long time. Let me tell you that. I mean, so this idea that they're doing constant operations and they haven't had any rest and they can't get replenished, which we can talk about the replenishment, because that is an absolute failure on the Navy's part. But is the stress and the exhaustion on the crew leads to things like we're seeing. And this is why they don't do that. This is why they pull in the port every 30 to 40 days. This is why if you're on a Navy ship, you get a beer call, you get beer on your 45th day at sea. That's like how extreme this is to be at sea without getting into a port for that long. That's standard practice in the Navy, is that if you're at sea for a month and a half without hitting a port, the captain opens up the beer locker, right? And, the crew gets beer because that's how stressful this is. So the thing about it, though, when it comes to this idea of replenishment, that their food is terrible, they can't get soap and deodorant and all these other things, that shouldn't be. The Navy's purpose is to fight wars. And so this idea that they can't replenish themselves underway when they're at war, that's just a failure of the Navy at its principal mission. This gets into the question then about the force. And what you have is you have an overextended, under-resourced force, both in terms of ships and personnel. I mean, this idea of expanding the Navy to over 300 ships again, and matching numbers with the Chinese, that sounds great. It costs us a fortune. It would take us 100 years to build those ships. Half of them wouldn't get built. And by the way, we don't have enough sailors to man them. We barely have enough sailors to man the current ships we have now, if we even have enough sailors to man them. You have to ask. Larry Wilkerson knows those numbers real well. So this idea, though, that we have this overextended, under-resourced fleet, undermanned fleet, that is exasperated by the fact that these ships don't work, that they break down all the time, that they can't be underway for extended periods without suffering problems. We saw a couple weeks ago the commander of American forces in Europe, who's responsible for the Mediterranean and so thereby responsible for the naval air defenses of Israel, saying, "I don't have enough destroyers. I've got 5 destroyers assigned to me and 3 are laid up in the yards. I've only got 2." Right? I mean, this idea with the carriers, why is the Lincoln still at sea? She replaced, as you said, the Ford. Why was the Ford at sea for so long when we have 11 carriers? And the whole idea is we're supposed to be able to surge up to 7 of them at one time, maybe 8 of them at one time. We can't. We can have 2 in operations total out of 11. And the George Washington, who is coming to replace the Lincoln, they're pulling her off of her post in Asia. Right. So the George Washington, which is one of our carriers that we keep in the South China Sea and in East Asia and, et cetera, because of China and North Korea, we're pulling her off of that station to put her in the Arabian Sea. We don't have anyone else. Where are the other 8 carriers? Well, they're all laid up in dry dock, or they've been laid up in the yards and they've been delayed. And so now those that are able to deploy are way behind on their training. right? And so we can't have them deploy until they're trained up, because you got to get them to be able to work with the air wings that are on board, et cetera, on and on and on. So, I mean, this really just shows, again, this superficiality, this paucity of not just the forces, but of the command. This has been a problem for decades. You had this issue with the Army and the Marine Corps throughout the Iraq and Afghan wars, where soldiers and Marines were going over for deployment after deployment after deployment because of the manning, because of the personnel issues, right? Because of our operational forces weren't resourced well enough to match up with their commitments. And you had generals who got promoted and got promoted and got promoted. And I mean, what do you have now? You have admirals and generals who came of age, who spent their careers, who learned to climb the ranks during these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Syria and Iraq against the Islamic State, our Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps were running out of bombs to fight the Islamic State and their pickup trucks, right? That was 10 years ago. And they didn't solve that problem. And now here we are. Right. I mean, so like, again, there's a lot to be said about the military industrial complex, how corrupt it is, how crooked it is, the reality that they produce weapons that are not meant to provide for the United States defense, but to provide for weapons contractors' profits. And what do you get then? You get ships that break down all the time, planes that can't fly, munitions that don't work as advertised, and that they can't produce enough for the United States to fight a war for more than a couple of months. But then also, too, you have this leadership. Right, these admirals and generals who have prospered through this corrupt and craven and weak American military, and now they're at the top. And so here are the results when we're actually in a war of choice, a war of aggression, but nonetheless a war with another nation state. And this is what's happening.
Matt, do you think that the way that Donald Trump is talking about the war is about making rhetoric, or he has something in his mind? Because after all, you mentioned the difficulties they're facing, these American forces. We assume, you mentioned that each in 30, 40 days, they have to go somewhere. These people, without that, it's going to be too difficult. And these people, these forces on aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, they were more than 250 days.
Yeah.
This is
the record.
I imagine. I saw one of the videos of one of these aircraft carriers. They sleep in a space like this. It's just unbelievable. It's a cell. It's unbelievable.
It's exhausting. It's nonstop. The carriers are conducting operations. I knew a guy who was a deck, worked on the decks of the carrier, and their berthing area, so where they slept, was below the flight deck. So it was constantly, which depends on which side of which end of the flight deck you're on, either the aircraft taking off or the aircraft landing on top of you, basically. And can you imagine that, right? That repetition day in, day out like that, living in that tight space. And now there's no soap and no deodorant, so everyone smells. Right? I mean, like we can laugh about it, but the reality is that stress, living essentially like in prison-like conditions at that tempo. And this is, a lot of that work is dangerous, difficult, stressful work. You're working on a deck of a carrier, and that's tough work. I mean, that's really tough work. And so this idea then of 5,000 men and women aboard that ship, and the breakdown that's occurring because of that exhaustion, whether it's mental or physical exhaustion. And that, is starting to show in, the issues with morale, but also too with, mental health problems in the form of, supposedly a good number of suicide attempts.
Yeah. Here is what Donald Trump said, Matt, just moments ago.
And after we finish defeating Iran, which is being very badly defeated, pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States. Essentially, that's what it is. We have the blockade. No ships get through unless we want them to.
this is what we're dealing with in the next 2.5 years. A man who, this is all about his personal legacy, and his personal legacy is what he defines in his own mind. I mean, so this is when people talk about historical episodes where you've had mad presidents, mad kings, mad emperors. This is what it looks like. This is what we're living through.
Do you feel that maybe somewhere in the establishment in the United States they would talk about what can we do with Donald Trump? Because it's totally, the reality is totally different from what he's talking about, and I don't know how long can he continue this way and trying to reshape the way that he feels about the conflict, not the reality is with the conflict.
How long can this be sustained?
Yeah.
You know, essentially, the United States was willing to spend about $8 trillion sustaining the Iraq and Afghan wars. They can do the same here.
Mm.
And again, it's just what degree of tempo and what type of limits do you want to set to keep this thing within a box, right? So, what red lines and thresholds have the Americans put in place that they're not going to exceed, or they're not going to do anything that's going to prompt an Iranian attack on Israel, say, right? But also, too, there are the very real limitations of the American forces. Again, whether it's the ships and planes that keep breaking down, or the munitions that are running out, the exhausted personnel, the incompetence of the American military leadership, et cetera. So what limitations are there? But essentially, this could carry on for years. I mean, to maintain a blockade as they are, yeah, that's very feasible. Having 20 ships out there, it's going to be difficult. It's going to put a lot of stress on the American Navy, which you would think 20 ships shouldn't really put a lot of stress on the American Navy, but as we're seeing, it does. And it causes the Americans to pull forces from other parts of the world. So as we just said, you're not going to have an aircraft carrier on station in East Asia, right? Because you got to pull her over to the Middle East. So maybe at some point they start to get into a rhythm and they establish a tempo and they're able to rotate forces in. And the same thing with the Air Forces, with the Navy and the Marine and the Air Force, squadrons. They can establish something where, particularly if it's like a limited engagement, they can get to a point where they're able to sustain what we've seen, say, over the last month or so. They could probably do that indefinitely. The problem being, though, is they can do that indefinitely, but you know what the Iranians can do? They can do more indefinitely, right? So as we saw in that 2-week period of combat that we had in July, where sure, the Americans launched a lot of sorties, they fired off a lot of their standoff attack munitions that it's going to take years to replenish. And what did they do to the Iranians? Did not, right? What effect did they have on the Iranians? Certainly on political will, they had none. They only actually reinforced Iranian political will and committed any uncommitted Iranians to the idea that there is no diplomatic solution here. We just have to control what we control and deter the Americans and the Israelis and their Arab allies continually. And I think that's the way Iran has to go forward here. But, in the sense, if the Americans, carry out what we think they're going to carry out, well, they're going to try and manage it so the Iranians' response is always limited or within the threshold or within the window that the Americans are attempting to act in. And I don't think the Iranians will do that. And we saw within that 2 weeks of combat back in July was the Iranians picked up where they left off and continued their degradation, their destruction of the key American bases in the Gulf. They really honed in on Kuwait and Bahrain for a couple of reasons. One, because the Kuwaitis and Bahrainis were the most active in their support to the Americans, but also too because they're a very key command and control as well as radar and communication facilities still in Kuwait and Bahrain. So the Iranians neutralized those. They pushed the American forces farther west so that the Americans are basically hunkered down in either Jordan and Israel. And then the Iranians, as we saw, I'd say in that second week of that 2-week combat, focused on Jordan. And just where you have these American forces consolidated, so easier targets, they went after them. And so there's no reason to believe that the Iranians have the under resources or the overextension or the shortfalls that the Americans do. So if this picks back up again in something similar to what we saw in July, then what's to stop the Iranians from pushing us into a third week or into a fourth week, as well as then forcing the Americans out of Jordan to where? Fully into Israel, to Greece, right? To Cyprus. That's essentially what you're looking at. So the American strategy here, if you can call it that, whatever they're going to do, the problem for them is that the Iranians can do more. And so the political will is such in the U.S., in Washington, D.C. And it's maddening because the public opinion polls, Nima, are all clear on this. If Donald Trump walks away from this, there is no political harm. There's already political harm from him starting this war. That's done. That's already sunk in. But if he walks away, he doesn't get any more political harm. He doesn't lose any more political capital from walking away from this, at least with the American people. But he won't do that. Washington, D.C. is still committed to victory here. And the American president, again, his metric for success is his own self-defined legacy in his own mind.